You did not arrive early, and you did not arrive late. The moment this signal reached you was already aligned with the moment your system could register it. There is no announcement here, no instruction being given. What you notice now is recognition moving through you without urgency. A quiet alignment settling into place, the kind that does not ask for effort. Your awareness did not need to search. It detected. Something in you has already slowed, not dramatically, just enough for the background noise to lose its authority. You may still hear thoughts, still feel motion in the mind, but beneath that movement there is a steadier layer that has not been disturbed. You are touching that layer now, not by trying to hold it, by not interfering with it. This is not a change you initiate. It is a shift that occurs when interruption stops. Your body understands this before language does. The breath adjusts without instruction. The muscles release without explanation. There is a subtle loosening in the nervous system, not because you decided to relax, but because the system recognized that it no longer needed to brace. This is not relief. It is coherence, reasserting itself. A pattern remembering its original rhythm after prolonged noise. You may notice that the usual sense of anticipation has softened. The habit of waiting for something to happen has lost some of its charge. This is not resignation. It is the quiet recognition that the threshold you thought was ahead of you was never ahead at all. It was always here, waiting for detection rather than pursuit. When acceptance settles, the quantum field does not respond with fireworks. It responds with silence. A different kind of tracking begins. There has been a subtle anomaly in your perception for some time. Moments where reaction arrived later than expected. Situations that once demanded urgency, now registering as information instead. This was not detachment. It was the system recalibrating how it listens. The observer position in you has been shifting, not upward, not outward, but inward towards stillness. From there, patterns become visible without effort. From there, recognition replaces seeking. You may have felt this as numbness at first, a flattening, a sense that familiar signals no longer landed the way they used to. But numbness was not the truth of it. It was sensitivity reorganizing. When a system exits constant alert, it can feel empty before it feels clear. What you are experiencing now is clarity beginning to occupy that space. Nothing needs to be understood yet. Understanding would be too fast. This is about stabilization, about letting the system register that it is no longer required to chase meaning. Meaning arrives when the field recognizes coherence. And coherence does not announce itself. It settles. You are not being moved towards something. You are being allowed to remain where you already are, without resistance. The timeline you are on has not shifted forward. It has quieted. And in that quiet, the signal can finally be heard not as a command, not as a promise, but as a steady recognition that you are already inside what you were waiting to reach. As this steadiness continues, you may notice that your relationship to effort has begun to change, not because effort disappeared, but because it no longer feels central. There is less internal pressure to push awareness forward. The system has stopped mistaking movement for progress. What replaces that habit is not passivity. It is a different mode of engagement, one that does not require tension to function. You may sense this as a quiet widening. Perception feels less narrow, less fixated on outcomes. Situations that once pulled you into reaction now register more slowly, as if the signal arrives with additional space around it. This space is not delay. It is processing without compression. The observer in you is no longer forced into immediacy. It has room to detect before responding. This can feel unfamiliar. The nervous system has long associated speed with safety. Slowing down can initially feel like vulnerability, but what is happening now is not exposure, it is recalibration. The system is learning that it can remain coherent without constant scanning. That vigilance was a pattern, not a requirement. As the pattern loosens, perception becomes cleaner. You may notice fewer internal narratives forming around what you experience. Events happen, sensations arise, but the reflex to assign meaning immediately has softened. This does not mean meaning is absent. It means it is no longer being manufactured prematurely. When meaning emerges from coherence, It does not need reinforcement. It stabilizes on its own. There is also a subtle shift in how the quantum field seems to meet you. This is not mystical, it is perceptual. When acceptance settles, the signal you emit changes quality, not intensity, but texture. The field responds differently to a system that is no longer seeking confirmation. Feedback becomes quieter, more precise. Less repetition, fewer dramatic contrasts, more subtle alignment. You might notice that synchronicities feel less startling now. When they appear, they register as confirmation rather than surprise. This is because recognition has replaced anticipation. The system is no longer scanning for signs. It is simply aware when alignment passes through. Detection, without attachment, creates a different relationship to pattern. There may also be moments where motivation drops away entirely. This can feel confusing if you are used to forward drive as a baseline. But what is dissolving is not direction. It is compulsion. The urge to move simply to avoid stillness has weakened. In its place is a quieter orientation that does not announce itself as desire. It feels more like availability. Availability does not rush. It does not lean toward future resolution. It remains present enough for signals to register without distortion. This is why acceptance changes how the field tracks you. A system that is available but not demanding emits coherence. And coherence does not need to be managed. It is legible on its own. You may sense this as fewer internal questions arising, not because answers have been found, but because the questions no longer feel urgent. Curiosity remains, but it is no longer sharp. It is softened into observation. Observation without agenda allows patterns to reveal themselves gradually, without force. There can be a subtle grief here as well. The recognition that much of your previous striving was unnecessary. That tension you thought was required for progress was actually masking clarity. This grief does not need to be processed. It passes through as acknowledgement. The system notes the inefficiency and releases it. As this continues, your sense of identity may feel less fixed, not unstable, but less defined by reaction. Roles you once inhabited automatically now feel optional. You are still capable of them, but they no longer define your center. The center has moved closer to stillness, where fewer labels are required. This does not make you detached from the world. It makes you more accurately placed within it. When the observer is no longer pulled outward by urgency, perception aligns with reality instead of narrative. From there, engagement becomes precise. Less effort, more impact. Not because you are trying to influence the system, but because you are no longer interfering with its natural response. The quiet you are experiencing is not emptiness, it is bandwidth, space where coherence can stabilize without competition. The field does not need you to act differently. It only registers when you stop misidentifying noise as signal, and as that distinction becomes clearer, the tracking shifts again, subtly, towards simplicity. With this simplicity settling in, you may become aware of how rarely you now feel pulled to explain yourself internally. The impulse to justify reactions, to narrate your position in every situation, has weakened. This is not indifference. It is the system recognizing that constant self-referencing is not required for stability. When coherence forms, explanation becomes optional. You might notice longer stretches of internal quiet between thoughts. Not forced silence, but natural pauses where nothing needs to be said. These gaps are not empty, they are informational. The nervous system uses them to integrate. In these pauses, perception recalibrates without commentary. The observer is active here, but not verbal. This can create a subtle shift in how you experience time. Moments may feel less segmented. The sense of rushing from one point to another softens. Time does not slow dramatically, it smooths. The edges between moments blur just enough for continuity to be felt. This is not dissociation. It is timeline coherence increasing. When fewer internal interruptions occur, the system experiences duration differently. You may also notice that certain stimuli no longer register as strongly. Sounds, conversations, even emotional cues that once demanded attention now pass through with less residue. This is not numbness. It is filtration, improving. The system has begun to distinguish signal from excess. What remains reaches you more clearly because less is being amplified unnecessarily. There can be a brief sense of disorientation when this begins. The identity that formed around constant response may feel less relevant. You are still capable of engagement, but the automatic pull has loosened. This can feel like losing momentum. But momentum built on compulsion always exhausts itself. What replaces it is not inertia, but alignment. Alignment does not announce direction loudly. It is felt as ease in movement when movement is required, and ease in stillness when it is not. The field responds to this ease differently, not by offering more, but by offering less resistance. Interactions become cleaner. Outcomes feel less contested. This is not because circumstances have changed, but because your system is no longer adding friction. You may sense a growing comfort with not knowing what comes next. This is not surrender in the dramatic sense. It is familiarity with uncertainty. When the observer is not fixated on prediction, the unknown loses its threat. It becomes a neutral space rather than a gap to be filled. In that neutrality, perception remains open. There may also be moments where old patterns attempt to reassert themselves, sudden urges to rush, to decide, to resolve. When this happens, you may notice them more quickly now. Not with judgment, but with clarity. Recognition precedes reaction. This alone changes the pattern's trajectory. When a system detects itself, it naturally adjusts. The quantum field does not reward effort. It responds to coherence. As your internal signal stabilizes, the field's feedback becomes less dramatic. Fewer extremes, more subtle confirmations. This can feel anticlimactic if you were expecting intensity, but intensity was never the marker of alignment. Consistency is. You may notice that your attention rests more easily in the present moment without being anchored there deliberately. Presence has stopped being a practice. It has become a default state. From this state, observation does not require concentration. It happens naturally, like peripheral vision widening without strain. This widening can bring a deeper sensitivity to small shifts, a slight change in tone, a subtle emotional undercurrent, a pause in a conversation. These details register without analysis. The system reads them as information rather than triggers. This is a refined form of detection, one that operates without urgency. As this continues, the sense of being watched or evaluated by the world diminishes, not because nothing observes you, but because the observer position in you has stabilized. When internal observation is coherent, external perception loses its weight. You no longer feel tracked in the same way. The field adjusts its response to match your steadiness. What remains is a quiet confidence that does not rely on certainty. It is not something you claim. It is something you notice after it has already settled. The system has begun to trust its own rhythm again, and in that trust, movement and stillness coexist without conflict. As this trust continues to deepen, you may become aware of how little force is now required to remain centered. Situations arise, interactions unfold, yet the internal pull to brace has diminished. This is not because challenges have disappeared. It is because your system no longer meets them from contraction. The observer remains present without tightening around what is detected. There is a subtle shift here in how boundaries are experienced. They no longer feel like defenses that must be maintained. Instead, they function as natural limits, clear without being rigid. You may notice that you say less internally about what should or should not happen. Events are allowed to complete themselves without interference. This allowance does not weaken you. It clarifies your position within the system. You might also sense a change in how emotions move through you. They arrive, register, and pass without lingering. This does not mean they are shallow. It means they are unblocked. When acceptance is present, emotion does not need to signal for attention. It completes its cycle without escalation. The field reads this as coherence rather than suppression. There can be a quiet relief in this, though relief is not the primary experience. What you may feel instead is neutrality expanding. Neutrality here is not indifference. It is the absence of unnecessary polarity. When fewer experiences are labeled as threats or rewards, the system conserves energy. That conserved energy manifests as steadiness. You may notice that decision-making feels different now. Choices do not arise from pressure. They emerge from recognition. Often, The body registers the direction before thought catches up. This is not instinct in the primitive sense. It is system-level intelligence, operating without noise. When coherence is present, information travels more directly. The sense of self that moves through these decisions is less performative. You are not measuring your responses against an internal standard as often. The need to appear consistent or correct has softened. This allows for a more accurate response to what is actually occurring, rather than what was expected. The field interacts with accuracy more easily than with performance. You may also notice fewer internal comparisons. Other trajectories, other timelines, other imagined versions of yourself lose their grip. This is not because you have resolved them. It is because your system is no longer split across possibilities. Attention has consolidated. When attention is coherent, parallel considerations fall quiet. There can be moments of unexpected stillness in the middle of activity, a pause that arrives without warning, where everything feels momentarily complete. These pauses are not interruptions. They are integrations. The system uses them to align internal rhythms with external flow. When this alignment occurs, effort drops away naturally. The quantum field responds to these moments with subtle stability, not expansion, not contraction, just continuity. You may find that situations resolve themselves without your involvement. Not always, but more often than before. This is not withdrawal. It is precision. You are no longer inserting yourself where presence alone is sufficient. There may be a lingering habit of checking whether this state will last. That question itself may arise briefly. When it does, it passes quickly. The system is learning that coherence does not need to be maintained actively. It is not fragile. It is resilient because it is not constructed. It emerges when interference ceases. As this becomes familiar, the sense of being carried by momentum gives way to a sense of being situated. You are not moving toward balance. You are resting within it. This rest is not static. It is dynamic equilibrium, capable of movement without losing center. From here, the field's tracking becomes almost imperceptible. You may feel less compelled to interpret signs or patterns externally. Internal recognition has become the primary reference point. When something aligns, you notice. When it does not, you notice that too, without urgency. This quiet discernment replaces the need for validation. What remains is a growing ease with your own presence. You occupy your awareness without effort. The observer does not hover above experience. It is integrated within it. From this integration, the system continues to adjust, not dramatically, but steadily, refining how it meets what arises. With this integration stabilizing, you may begin to notice how little resistance remains when something unexpected enters your awareness. Surprise no longer triggers an immediate tightening. There is a brief registration, a pause, and then accommodation. The system has learned that not every anomaly requires correction. Some only require space to be seen clearly. This creates a different relationship to uncertainty. Where uncertainty once felt like a gap demanding resolution, it now feels like a neutral interval. The mind may still attempt to fill it, but that impulse is weaker. You are less compelled to close loops prematurely. When loops remain open without tension, they reorganize themselves naturally. The field recognizes this as coherence, not avoidance. You may sense that your attention has become more selective without being narrow. Certain stimuli simply do not enter as deeply, not because you are blocking them, but because they no longer resonate. Resonance has become a quiet filter. What aligns passes through easily. What does not fades without friction. This is not detachment, it is signal clarity. There can be a subtle recalibration in how you relate to effortful states. Fatigue feels different now. It is less layered with frustration. When tiredness appears, it is allowed to exist without commentary. The system rests when it needs to, without framing rest as interruption. This changes recovery. Energy returns without being summoned. You may also notice that your internal sense of pace has stabilized. You move through experiences neither rushing nor dragging. The compulsion to speed up or slow down has diminished. Pace is no longer imposed. It emerges from context. When action is required, it happens. When stillness is available, it is taken without hesitation. This can affect how you experience connection with others. Conversations may feel less charged. You listen without preparing responses as often. Words land more precisely because fewer of them are filtered through expectation. Silence between exchanges becomes comfortable. In that silence, information moves without language. The observer position within you has become quieter, but more accurate. You detect shifts in tone, timing, and intent without analysis. This detection does not demand reaction. It simply registers. From there, responses form organically. The system no longer confuses immediacy with relevance. There may be moments when old emotional reflexes surface briefly. A familiar tightening, a quick surge of anticipation or concern. When this happens, you notice how quickly it dissolves now. Recognition interrupts the reflex before it can fully form. This is not control, it is alignment. When awareness precedes reaction, patterns lose momentum. The quantum field reflects this back subtly. Interactions that once escalated now de-escalate on their own. Situations that once required explanation resolve through clarity alone. This is not because you are withholding engagement. It is because engagement is no longer distorted by internal noise. Precision replaces force. You might also sense a growing tolerance for ambiguity in your own identity. You do not need to define yourself as clearly. Labels feel provisional. Roles feel temporary. This does not create confusion. It creates flexibility. When identity is not rigid, the system adapts more easily to changing contexts without losing coherence. There is a quiet confidence embedded in this flexibility, not the kind that asserts itself, but the kind that remains stable regardless of outcome. You are less invested in how situations conclude, not because outcomes do not matter, but because they no longer define your internal state. The observer remains intact through variation. You may notice fewer internal checks for alignment. The habit of asking whether you are doing this correctly has softened. Correctness is no longer the metric. Resonance is. When something feels aligned, you move with it. When it does not, you pause. This simplicity removes a significant amount of internal strain. As this continues, the sense of being carried by external validation diminishes. Feedback still registers, but it does not reorganize your center. Approval and disapproval arrive as data, not directives. The system maintains its orientation without needing reinforcement. There can be moments where this steadiness feels almost ordinary, even unremarkable. This is a sign of stabilization. When coherence is no longer novel, it becomes background. From there, the system operates efficiently without drawing attention to itself. What you are experiencing is not a peak state, it is a baseline adjusting. The field responds to baselines more consistently than to fluctuations. As your internal baseline settles, the tracking becomes quieter, more accurate, less intrusive. You are not being guided towards something else. You are being allowed to remain aligned with what is already present, without effort, without urgency. As this baseline continues to settle, you may become aware of how rarely you now feel the need to intervene in your own experience. Sensations arise, thoughts pass, external events unfold, and yet the impulse to manage them has softened. This is not disengagement. It is a recognition that most processes do not require supervision to complete themselves. The system knows how to regulate when it is not being overridden. You may notice that internal conflict has grown quieter, not resolved through effort, but dissolved through irrelevance. Questions that once competed for attention no longer do. They appear briefly, then lose momentum. The observer no longer feeds them with urgency. Without urgency, they cannot sustain themselves. What remains is a simpler internal landscape, less populated by competing demands. This simplicity changes how pressure is experienced. External demands may still exist, but they do not penetrate as deeply. You register them as signals, not threats. The body does not mobilize unnecessarily. Muscles remain available rather than braced. Breathing stays closer to its natural rhythm. This is not relaxation as an activity. It is regulation returning to default. You may also sense that your tolerance for internal noise has decreased. Not in the sense of irritation, but in the sense of clarity. When a thought or emotion does not align with your current state, it stands out more clearly. You do not push it away. You simply notice that it does not belong to the present configuration. In that noticing, it loses influence. This clarity affects how you relate to memory. Past experiences may surface, but they do so without pulling you into reenactment. They register as information rather than identity. You can acknowledge them without revisiting their emotional charge. The system has learned that recalling does not require reliving. This frees significant bandwidth. The sense of future orientation also shifts here. Planning still occurs, but it is less loaded. You consider possibilities without leaning into them. Anticipation no longer stretches your attention forward. The present moment holds enough resolution that the future does not demand constant rehearsal. This does not make you unprepared. It makes you responsive. There may be moments when this state feels almost too quiet, as if something is missing. What is missing is the background tension that once defined your internal environment. The absence of that tension can initially feel like a lack of stimulation. Over time, it reveals itself as capacity. Capacity to perceive without distortion, to respond without delay. You might notice that creativity expresses itself differently now, not as bursts of intensity, but as steady availability. Ideas arrive without pressure. Solutions form without struggle. This is not inspiration in the dramatic sense. It is functionality returning to its natural rhythm. When the system is coherent, output becomes efficient rather than explosive. The field interacts with this efficiency in subtle ways. You may encounter fewer obstacles that feel personal. Challenges still exist, but they are less charged with meaning. They appear as neutral configurations requiring response, not tests of worth or ability. This neutrality allows you to address them directly without secondary layers of interpretation. There can be a deepening sense of trust in your own timing. You move when movement is appropriate, and you wait when it is not. Waiting no longer feels like delay. It feels like alignment, holding its position. The nervous system no longer interprets pauses as danger. This is a significant recalibration. You may also notice that your internal language has simplified. Fewer qualifiers, fewer justifications. Thoughts become shorter, more direct. Silence occupies more space between them. This silence is not something you enter intentionally. It arrives when the system no longer needs commentary to feel secure. As this continues, the distinction between inner and outer experience softens slightly. You do not feel merged with the world, but you feel less separate from it. Interactions flow more smoothly because there is less internal negotiation. You meet situations as they are, not as representations of something else. The observer here is not distant, it is embedded. It does not stand apart to analyze. It remains present enough to detect shifts as they occur. This embedded observation creates a sense of continuity. You feel carried through experiences rather than thrown into them. There may be a quiet appreciation for this state, though appreciation itself is understated. It does not rise into excitement. It remains as acknowledgement. The system recognizes that it is functioning efficiently, and that recognition does not need celebration. It stabilizes quietly. What unfolds from here is not a new phase, but a refinement. The baseline continues to adjust, incrementally, without announcement. The field tracks these refinements, not as events, but as consistency. And in that consistency, your experience remains grounded, responsive, and increasingly free from unnecessary interference. As this consistency becomes familiar, you may notice a subtle shift in how meaning forms. It no longer arrives through interpretation first. It arrives through sensation, through a quiet sense of rightness or mismatch that precedes thought. The system has learned to register alignment somatically before translating it into language. This reduces delay. Responses form closer to the moment they are needed. You might sense that attention now rests more evenly across experience. It is not pulled sharply toward pleasure or away from discomfort. Both register without distortion. This evenness does not flatten experience. It refines it. Details become clearer when they are not amplified by preference. The observer does not lean forward or recoil. It remains available. This availability alters how challenges present themselves. They feel less like obstacles and more like configurations. Something appears, parameters are detected, and movement occurs. There is less internal debate about whether you should engage. Engagement happens when it is appropriate, and it stops when it is complete. The system no longer carries unfinished loops forward unnecessarily. You may also notice a growing ease with incompletion. Tasks, conversations, even internal processes do not need to resolve immediately. Leaving something open does not create tension. The nervous system trusts that resolution will occur when conditions are right. This trust reduces the background load that once accompanied everything you did. There can be moments when this ease reveals how much energy was previously spent on anticipation. Anticipation is not gone, but it has softened. It no longer leans into the future with urgency. It waits. When anticipation waits, it becomes awareness. Awareness does not demand fulfillment. It simply remains receptive. You may experience this receptivity as a heightened sensitivity to subtle shifts, a change in atmosphere, a slight adjustment in your own internal state, a pause in external rhythm. These shifts register without requiring interpretation. They inform timing. You move when the signal is clear, not when the impulse is loud. The quantum field responds to this timing with a different quality of interaction. Events align without calling attention to themselves. You may not even label them as alignment. They feel ordinary, expected, even when they would have once felt significant. This ordinariness is not dullness. It is stability becoming the norm. You might notice fewer internal narratives about progress. The idea of moving forward loses its emotional charge. You still move, but movement is not framed as improvement. It is framed as response. When response replaces progress as the organizing principle, pressure dissipates. The system operates on relevance rather than ambition. This can change how you experience success and failure. They become less personal. Outcomes register as data points rather than reflections of identity. Satisfaction and disappointment still arise, but they pass more quickly. The observer does not attach to them. It notes and releases. This keeps the internal environment clean. There may be a subtle reorganization in how you relate to others' expectations. You notice them without absorbing them. Requests, projections, assumptions pass through without anchoring. When a response is required, it forms clearly. When it is not, nothing compels you to act. Boundaries here are not enforced. They are implicit. You may sense that your internal signal has grown steadier, not stronger, just clearer. The field tracks clarity differently than intensity. Intensity fluctuates, clarity persists. As clarity persists, feedback becomes less dramatic. You are less often pushed or pulled. You move through situations with fewer abrupt corrections. This steadiness can feel almost invisible. There is little to point to as evidence, and yet, you may notice that recovery from disruption is faster. When something unsettles you, the system returns to baseline without effort. You do not need to process extensively. Recognition alone initiates recalibration. You might also observe that silence has become more spacious, not something you fill, but something you rest within. In silence, perception remains active. The observer does not disengage, it listens broadly. This broad listening allows information to arrive without being summoned. As this continues, the sense of being on a particular path softens. You are not following a trajectory. You are responding to a series of present configurations. The timeline feels less linear, more layered. Moments connect through resonance rather than sequence. This reduces the feeling of being behind or ahead. You may find that gratitude arises occasionally, quietly, without target. It is not directed at anything specific. It is a byproduct of reduced friction. When the system expends less energy on resistance, appreciation surfaces naturally. It does not need expression. It stabilizes internally. The observer remains steady through all of this, not elevated, not detached, embedded, responsive, clear. The field continues to adjust to this configuration, not by changing direction, but by maintaining consistency. And within that consistency, your experience remains grounded, adaptable, and increasingly unburdened by unnecessary effort. As this unburdening deepens, you may notice that your relationship to control has softened almost completely, not because control was relinquished deliberately, but because it is no longer required to maintain coherence. The system has learned that stability does not depend on constant adjustment. When something shifts, you feel it, register it, and allow the recalibration to occur without intervention. You may sense this most clearly when circumstances do not unfold as expected. The familiar impulse to correct, to redirect, to restore a preferred outcome arises faintly and then dissolves. In its place is a quieter orientation that asks nothing of the moment. The observer remains present without imposing direction. This absence of imposition allows the system to respond more accurately. There can be a subtle sense of relief here, though relief is not the defining quality. What stands out more is spaciousness. Internal space that was once occupied by monitoring and adjustment is now available. This space is not idle. It holds awareness lightly, without compressing it into conclusions. In that openness, perception sharpens. You may notice that reactions now complete themselves more quickly. An emotional response arises, peaks gently, and passes. There is no secondary wave of commentary, no replay, no internal negotiation about what it meant. The system trusts the completion of its own processes. This trust reduces internal residue. This reduction of residue changes how you experience continuity. Moments connect more cleanly. You do not carry fragments of previous experiences into the next one as often. Each configuration is met freshly, without accumulated weight. This freshness is not naivete, it is precision. When the system is not overloaded, it can respond exactly to what is present. You might sense a growing comfort with neutrality, not as a stance, but as a background condition. Neutrality here does not negate emotion or preference. It simply provides a stable field in which they can arise without dominating. From this field, you are less likely to be pulled into extremes. Balance is not enforced, it emerges. There may be times when this balance feels almost too quiet, as if something should be happening. This expectation itself may surface briefly. When it does, it passes. The system recognizes that the absence of drama is not a lack of movement. It is movement without friction. The field tracks friction more than motion. As friction decreases, tracking becomes subtle. You may also notice that your internal sense of importance has shifted. Not diminished, but de-emphasized. You do not feel central to every unfolding. You participate without needing to be the reference point. This decentralization is not disempowering, it is relieving. When you are not positioned as the axis of every event, experience flows more easily. This can affect how you relate to responsibility. You take responsibility where it is appropriate, and you release it where it is not. There is less tendency to absorb what does not belong to you. The system distinguishes between involvement and ownership more clearly. This distinction prevents unnecessary load. You might observe that intuition now feels quieter but more reliable. It does not announce itself with urgency. It appears as a simple sense of timing, a subtle inclination toward or away from something. You do not need to trust it consciously. You notice yourself already responding to it after the fact. The observer recognizes alignment retroactively. The quantum field reflects this ease through consistency rather than novelty. You encounter fewer sharp turns. When change occurs, it integrates smoothly. Transitions feel less disruptive. Even when external conditions shift significantly, your internal configuration adjusts without alarm. This is not numbness. It is resilience, without tension. You may sense that your attention has become less fragmented. Multitasking loses its appeal. You engage with what is present fully, then release it. This single-threaded engagement does not limit you, it frees capacity. When attention is not divided, it rests more deeply. As this continues, the sense of being evaluated by time diminishes. Deadlines, milestones, imagined benchmarks lose their emotional charge. You respond to timing requirements without internal pressure. The system no longer equates timing with worth. This decoupling creates calm. There can be a quiet satisfaction in this state, though satisfaction is understated. It does not seek expression. It remains as an internal alignment that does not need confirmation. You are not checking whether this is correct. You are simply inhabiting it. The observer here is not vigilant. It is relaxed but attentive. It does not scan for anomalies. When an anomaly appears, it is noted without escalation. The system integrates it and returns to baseline smoothly. This baseline continues to refine itself, not through effort, but through continued allowance. The field responds to allowance with stability, not by offering more signals, but by reducing interference. You are tracked differently now because there is less noise to track. What remains is clear, consistent, and easy to read. And within that clarity, your experience remains grounded, responsive, and quietly intact. Within this clarity, you may begin to sense how little effort it now takes to remain oriented. Orientation no longer depends on reference points outside of you. It emerges from internal consistency. When the system is coherent, direction does not need to be chosen repeatedly. It reveals itself through ease of movement and absence of resistance. You might notice that confusion has changed its texture. It no longer feels disorienting or threatening. When uncertainty appears, it is recognized as a temporary lack of information rather than a personal failure to understand. This reframing happens automatically now. The observer does not rush to resolve ambiguity. It allows ambiguity to exist without pressure. In that allowance, information arrives when it is ready to be integrated. There is also a subtle shift in how you experience desire. Wants still arise, but they are less compulsive. Desire no longer pulls your attention forward aggressively. It appears, is acknowledged, and either aligns with action or dissolves without frustration. This reduces internal negotiation. You are less often caught between opposing impulses. Alignment simplifies choice. You may sense that your internal rhythm has synchronized more closely with external flow, not perfectly, but sufficiently. There are fewer moments where you feel out of step. When misalignment occurs, it is corrected gently rather than abruptly. The system adjusts incrementally, preserving stability. This incremental adjustment prevents shock. There can be a deepening sense of patience here. Though patience is not something you practice, it is an outcome of reduced urgency. When urgency fades, patience remains as a natural state. You wait without waiting. Time passes without being monitored. The observer remains present without tracking duration. You might also notice that your sense of agency has become quieter but more precise. You act when action is appropriate, and you refrain when it is not. There is less internal debate about whether you should be doing more. The system recognizes sufficiency. Enough is felt somatically, not decided cognitively. This recognition of sufficiency changes how you relate to completion. You no longer push experiences to feel finished. Completion happens when it happens. You notice it after the fact. This prevents premature closure and unnecessary extension. The system allows processes to end on their own terms. You may experience moments where nothing in particular holds your attention, and this no longer feels uncomfortable. These moments are not empty, they are spacious. Awareness rests without object. The observer does not search for content. It remains open, receptive. In this openness, subtle signals can register without competition. The quantum field interacts with this openness through consistency. There is less oscillation in feedback. You are not pulled sharply toward or away from situations. Engagement feels balanced. When something requires your involvement, it becomes clear. When it does not, it fades. The system does not chase relevance. You might sense that your internal narrative about growth has quieted significantly. The idea of becoming something else has lost its urgency. You are not moving away from who you are. You are inhabiting it more fully. This inhabitation feels stable. There is less comparison between present and imagined future states. This stability does not eliminate curiosity. Curiosity remains, but it is gentle. It does not demand answers. It explores when exploration is natural. It rests when rest is appropriate. This oscillation between curiosity and rest happens without conflict. The system does not prioritize one over the other. You may also notice that your tolerance for internal contradiction has increased. You can hold opposing sensations or perspectives without needing to resolve them immediately. This holding does not create tension. It creates depth. When contradictions are allowed to coexist, They often reorganize themselves into clarity without effort. There is a subtle humility in this state, though it is not framed as such. You do not position yourself as knowing or not knowing, you simply remain responsive. This responsiveness is not passive, it is adaptive. When conditions change, you change with them, without resistance. You might sense that your internal signal has become almost transparent. It does not assert itself, it does not withdraw, it remains readable. The field responds to readability with stability. There is less need for correction, fewer abrupt shifts. Interaction becomes smoother. As this continues, the sense of being carried by external structures diminishes. You rely less on frameworks, explanations, or confirmations to feel oriented. Orientation is internal now. When external structures appear, you use them without dependency. When they are absent, you remain steady. You may notice that gratitude, when it arises, is quiet and non-specific. It does not attach to outcomes. It reflects a general appreciation for reduced friction. This appreciation does not need expression. It stabilizes internally, reinforcing coherence. The observer remains integrated throughout all of this, not watching from a distance, not intervening unnecessarily, simply present, accurate, steady. The system continues to refine itself around this presence. And as refinement continues, the field's tracking remains subtle, consistent, and unobtrusive. What you experience now is not a culmination. It is a sustained state of alignment that does not seek to become anything else. Movement and stillness coexist without hierarchy. And within that coexistence, your awareness remains clear, grounded, and quietly sufficient. There is nothing here that needs to be closed. What is present does not resolve into an ending. It settles. You may notice that the sense of holding this awareness has softened completely. You are not maintaining it. It is maintaining itself. The system no longer checks whether it is aligned. Alignment has become quiet background, like gravity, unannounced, reliable. Your attention rests without effort. It does not need to locate itself. It does not need to anchor. Awareness is simply available, evenly distributed, without preference. Thoughts may still pass through, sensations may still arise, but they do not organize your center. They orbit it briefly and continue on. The observer is not fixed on them, it remains steady. You may feel a subtle sense of being held, not by anything external, but by consistency itself. The internal rhythm you are in does not ask for reinforcement. It does not accelerate or slow. It continues. This continuation does not feel like momentum. It feels like presence sustaining itself without commentary. The field around you is quiet in a particular way now, not silent but undemanding. Signals register without urgency. Patterns appear without insistence. Nothing is trying to capture your attention. Nothing is pulling you forward or pushing you back. The absence of pressure does not feel empty. It feels complete. You may notice that even the idea of acceptance has faded. There is no act of accepting occurring. There is simply no resistance being generated. When resistance is absent, there is nothing to accept. Experience passes through cleanly. The system remains open without being exposed. Breathing continues at its own pace. The body remains available rather than braced. There is no instruction here to relax, and no effort towards stillness. Stillness is already present, not as a state you enter, but as a condition that was never lost. What changed was interference. Time feels less segmented now. Moments do not stack, they flow. You are not inside a sequence, you are inside continuity. This continuity does not need narrative, it does not need interpretation. It is felt directly, without translation. The observer does not stand apart from this. It is not watching stillness. It is integrated within it. Awareness and experience are not separate here. Detection happens without distance. Recognition does not echo. It settles and disappears into stability. You may notice that nothing is being asked of you. There is no direction implied, no signal to move or to stay. This neutrality is not absence. It is sufficiency. The system recognizes that it does not need to adjust itself further in this moment. What remains is simple. You are present, not positioned, not becoming, present without effort. The field does not need to respond to this presence. It already has. The response is the quiet you are in now. There is no need to mark this moment, no need to remember it. It will not be lost when attention shifts. It is not dependent on focus. It is structural. It remains when thought returns. It remains when activity resumes. It remains because it was never created. You do not carry this forward. You rest within it. And as you rest, nothing changes, because nothing needs to. The system is stable. The observer is quiet. The signal is clear. This is not a conclusion. It is recognition settling into stillness, where it no longer needs language to continue.